The Galactic Collective Research Assembly orbited Voral Prime, its lattice-like corridors and crystalline spires glinting against the vibrant green glow of the gas giant below. The assembly was the crown jewel of the known universe, where the greatest minds from 36 species gathered to solve the unsolvable. Yet, in the largest amphitheater of this awe-inspiring station, hope had given way to resignation. At the center of the amphitheater, a hologram of the Eternal Gateway, a massive crystalline ring, meant to stabilize a wormhole for permanent intergalactic travel, spun slowly. Dr. Selmar, the Zorvaxian physicist leading the project, stood at the podium, his azure skin glowing faintly under the room's ultraviolet lights. Despite exhaustive efforts, Selmar said, his voice tight with frustration, the Eternal Gateway project has failed. The energy requirements to maintain stability exceed the output of any known celestial body. Cascading instabilities render further tests not only futile but dangerous. In short, this endeavor is impossible. The amphitheater erupted in murmurs, punctuated by the occasional trill of alien disappointment. Selmar raised a hand, silencing the crowd. I assure you, we have explored every avenue. The wormhole's collapse during the last test was unequivocal proof. Continuing to waste resources on this fantasy is illogical. From the back of the room, a human voice cut through the low hum of dissent like a whip crack. Define impossible. Every head turned toward the source of the interruption. Nate Calloway, a scruffy human with a battered flight jacket and a grin that bordered on reckless, leaned back in his chair. In one hand, he held a can of beer. Dr. Selmar glared, his crimson eyes narrowing. The human delegation wishes to comment. Sure do, Nate said, standing up. Now, I'm just a simple guy from Earth, but back home, when somebody says something's impossible, what they really mean is nobody's figured it out yet. A Corlean delegate, their blue-scaled face glinting under the amphitheater's lights, let out a derisive snort. You're suggesting this assembly comprising the greatest minds in the galaxy has somehow overlooked a solution that you could find. Nate shrugged, taking a sip of his beer. Maybe. Or maybe you're all so busy trying to prove it's impossible, you missed the obvious answer. Selmar's indigo complexion deepened a Zorvaxian sign of irritation. The laws of physics are not subject to human bravado, Mr. Calloway. This isn't about creativity, it's about reality. Well, Doc, Nate said, holding up his beer can, hold this. I'm about to get creative with your reality. A stunned silence fell over the room. Selmar blinked. You intend to attempt what we have deemed impossible. Yep, Nate said, striding toward the stage. Worst case scenario, I prove you right, and you get to say I told you so. Best case, I get this thing humming, and you can all thank me later. A murmur of intrigue rippled through the amphitheater. Kira, a translucent Tevelin whose body refracted light into a soft kaleidoscope of colors, leaned towards Selmar. It is a curious proposition. If the human wishes to waste his time, perhaps it will serve as a final demonstration of futility. Selmar's lip curled, but he finally relented. Very well, Mr. Calloway. You have one cycle. Attempt your experiment, but do not expect our assistance. Nate grinned, tipping an imaginary hat to the room. Wouldn't dream of it, Doc. The Gateway Lab was a symphony of sleek technology. The crystalline ring, suspended in midair, shimmered faintly with dormant energy. Dozens of consoles lined the walls, each one blinking with alien symbols that Nate couldn't read but assumed were important. Selmar stood at the door, arms crossed as Nate sauntered in. This is a highly sophisticated facility, Selmar said coldly, not a playground. Good thing I'm not here to play, Nate replied, cracking his knuckles. Kira, who had followed Selmar, observed Nate curiously. What is your approach, Mr. Calloway? Nate crouched by the gateway, examining its crystalline panels. Simple. You've been trying to force this thing to work the way you think it should work. I'm going to find out how it wants to work. Selmar frowned. The gateway is a machine. It does not want anything. Everything's got a rhythm, Nate said, tapping the frame with his knuckles. You just have to listen for it. The Zorvaxian's indigo hue darkened further. This is absurd. Maybe, Nate said, shrugging, But hey, absurd's kind of my specialty. Over the next several hours, Nate's unorthodox methods left the assembled scientists bewildered. He bypassed systems they deemed critical, rerouted energy pathways, and made adjustments based on what he called gut instinct. "Are you even documenting your changes?" Selmar demanded as Nate tweaked a glowing console. "Not yet," Nate replied. "Kinda busy figuring it out as I go." "Figuring it out," Selmar repeated, aghast. "That is not how science works." "It's how discovery works," Nate countered. Despite their skepticism, the data told a different story. The gateway, which had previously sputtered and destabilized under even minor tests, began to show signs of stability. Energy readings leveled out. The crystalline panels emitted a steady, rhythmic hum. Kira watched the monitors with wide, prismatic eyes. The readings. "They're stabilizing." Selmar, though clearly unwilling to admit it, couldn't deny what he saw. "How?" "Sometimes you just need fresh eyes," Nate said, wiping his hands on his jacket. "Or in my case, stubborn ones." By the end of the cycle, the gateway stood ready for its first true test. A crowd of skeptical yet intrigued scientists gathered in the lab, their collective attention fixed on the crystalline ring. "This is madness," Selmar muttered. "Probably," Nate replied, flipping a switch. "But I'd call it fun." The gateway roared to life, its frame glowing as a vortex of shimmering energy formed within. The crowd held its breath as the vortex stabilized, its swirling surface smooth and steady. "Energy levels holding," Kira reported, her voice tinged with awe. Selmar stared at the monitors in disbelief. "It's stable." "Told you it wasn't impossible," Nate said, leaning casually against a console. The scientists erupted into murmurs, their astonishment palpable. For the first time in its existence, the Eternal Gateway was functional. Nate crossed his arms, grinning at Selmar. "So Doc, what's next?" "Want me to find you a spaceship to toss through?" Selmar blinked, clearly unprepared for such a question. "We will discuss next steps shortly." "Take your time," Nate said, cracking open another beer. "I'll be right here when you need me." The shimmering vortex of the Eternal Gateway cast dancing lights across the lab as the assembled scientists scrutinized the data flooding the monitors. For the first time in the project's tumultuous history, the numbers made sense. The wormhole's energy levels were stable, its harmonics perfectly balanced. Nate leaned against a console, sipping his beer while the aliens buzzed around him in a mix of awe and skepticism. Kira's crystalline glow pulsed rhythmically, a Tevelin gesture of curiosity. "You have accomplished what the assembly deemed impossible," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "What do you propose we do now?" "Easy," Nate said, setting his can on a nearby panel. "We use it, send something through, see what happens." Selmar's head snapped toward him, his indigo complexion darkening further. "You are suggesting we risk another failure immediately? The potential for instability is why you've got monitors," Nate interrupted, gesturing at the dozens of glowing screens. "Look, the only way to know for sure if it'll hold is to push it. You're not going to learn much staring at it all day." Kira tilted her head. "There is logic in his suggestion, Dr. Selmar. The data indicates stability. A controlled test could provide valuable insight." Selmar's jaw tightened, but he gave a reluctant nod. "Very well. Prepare an unmanned probe." Within minutes, the team had readied a sleek, disc-shaped drone no larger than a Corleone's torso. It hovered silently as it was guided toward the vortex, its surface reflecting the swirling energy of the wormhole. Nate stood with his arms crossed, watching intently. "What's the worst that could happen?" "A great deal," Selmar muttered. "If the gateway destabilizes mid-transit, the feedback could turn the drone into scrap metal," Nate finished. "But it won't. Trust me." Selmar narrowed his eyes. "Trust is not a scientific methodology." "Then call it faith," Nate said, smirking. The countdown began. At 0, the drone entered the vortex, its sleek form disappearing into the shimmering swirl without a sound. The room fell silent, save for the steady hum of the gateway. Monitors displayed telemetry from the drone positional data, atmospheric readings, and energy outputs from the far side of the wormhole. Telemetry is nominal, a Corlean technician reported, their melodic voice tinged with disbelief. The probe is. It's in the target system. Cheers erupted around the lab, a chaotic symphony of relief and triumph. Nate raised his beer in mock celebration, glancing at Selmar. How's that for impossible? Selmar's expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. The next several hours were a blur of tests and incremental triumphs. The probe successfully transmitted data from the far side of the wormhole before returning, its surface untouched. Encouraged by the results, the team sent increasingly complex payloads, communication satellites, biological samples, and experimental equipment. Each returned intact, their telemetry confirming the wormhole's stability. Nate became the unlikely center of attention. Delegates who had dismissed him as a reckless outsider now approached him with questions and tentative praise. "You have exceeded expectations," Kira said during a quiet moment. "The collective owes you much." "Yeah, well," Nate replied, shrugging. "If there's one thing humans are good at, it's winging it." Selmar, overhearing the comment, frowned. "Your methods are unconventional. Relying on instinct over calculation is an inherently flawed approach." "And yet here we are," Nate said, gesturing at the humming gateway. Kira's glow brightened in amusement. "Perhaps your instincts are an undervalued resource, Dr. Selmar." Selmar bristled but said nothing, his attention shifting back to the monitors. By the third day of continuous testing, the collective decided it was time for the ultimate trial, the first manned mission. Delegates from various species volunteered for the historic journey, their enthusiasm tempered by the magnitude of the risk. The lab buzzed with tension as the three-member crew boarded a small, state-of-the-art vessel designed for wormhole transit. The ship's sleek hull shimmered with the same crystalline alloy as the gateway, a deliberate safeguard against unforeseen instability. Selmar stood at the main console, his fingers poised over the controls. "This mission represents the culmination of our combined efforts," he announced to the room. "Proceed with the utmost caution." "Don't look at me," Nate said, raising his hands. "I'm just the guy who made it work." Kira stepped forward, her glow steady and calm. "The crew is prepared. All systems are functioning within parameters. Initiate launch sequence." The countdown began. Nate leaned against a console, his heart pounding despite his outward nonchalance. At 0, the vessel launched smoothly into the vortex. The room fell silent as the shimmering wormhole rippled faintly, then returned to perfect stability. Monitors lit up with telemetry data, confirming the ship's successful entry. Moments later, a communication feed crackled to life, the crew's voices clear and steady. "This is the Daedalus," the pilot announced. "We have exited the wormhole. Conditions are nominal. We're in the target system." The lab erupted into applause. Even Selmar allowed himself a rare smile. Nate exhaled, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned. It worked." Kira turned to him, her glow bright with admiration. "Your contribution has been invaluable, Nate Calloway. You have accomplished what we once thought impossible." "Not bad for a guy with a wrench and a beer," Nate said, chuckling. As the ship prepared to return through the wormhole, Nate's grin faltered. He turned to the shimmering vortex, his gut tightening with unease. "Something wrong?" Kira asked, noticing his shift in demeanor. "Probably not," Nate said, staring at the gateway. "But let's just hope the universe doesn't decide to mess with us now." The return trip of the Daedalus began smoothly. The wormhole shimmered with steady energy, its crystalline frame glowing in perfect harmony. Monitors displayed flawless telemetry, energy output stable, spatial coordinates aligned. "Re-entry confirmed," Selmar announced from the main console, his voice tinged with a rare note of satisfaction. "The Daedalus is en route." Nate leaned back against a console, arms crossed, watching the monitors. For once, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. The wormhole rippled, the first sign of the Daedalus's emergence. The room held its collective breath as the vessel's sleek silhouette appeared within the swirling vortex. It glided through the crystalline ring with a grace that drew a cheer from the gathered scientists. Telemetry nominal, Kira said, her glow brightening with relief. The crew is reporting no anomalies. Nate let out a low whistle, flashing a grin at Selmar. Well, Doc, looks like your precious gateway's finally earning its keep. Selmar offered a curt nod, his pride clearly wrestling with his grudging respect. It seemed so. The lab erupted into applause, a cacophony of triumph that echoed through the observation deck. Delegates embraced, technicians exchanged handshakes, and even Selmar allowed himself a rare smile. But Nate didn't join the celebration. His eyes were locked on the wormhole, now quiet and serene. Something about the vortex's earlier ripple lingered in his mind. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to set his instincts on edge. "You okay?" Kira asked, her voice soft. "Yeah," Nate said slowly, not taking his eyes off the gateway. I don't like it when things go too smooth, you know. Feels like the universe is winding up for a curveball." Over the next few days, the Daedalus mission was hailed as a monumental success. Delegates from every species in the collective lauded the gateway as the future of intergalactic travel. Plans were drafted for expanded operations, exploratory missions, trade routes, even colonization efforts. Nate, however, couldn't shake his unease. He pored over logs from the Daedalus mission, scrutinizing every energy fluctuation, every minor deviation in telemetry. Most were negligible, well within the parameters the gateway was designed to handle. And yet the ripple during re-entry nagged at him. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" Selmar asked one evening, finding Nate hunched over a console in the otherwise empty lab. "Anything that doesn't fit," Nate said without looking up. Selmar sighed, his tone carrying equal parts irritation and exhaustion. The gateway has demonstrated stability under every conceivable condition. At some point you must accept that. There, Nate interrupted, pointing at the screen. Selmar frowned, stepping closer. "What am I looking at?" "Right there," Nate said, highlighting a tiny spike in the gateway's energy harmonics during the Daedalus's re-entry. "It's small, but it's there, and it's not random." Selmar studied the data, his expression unreadable. An energy surge. Minor, well within acceptable tolerances. "Sure, but it's the same kind of surge I saw during the unmanned tests," Nate said, "and during the last few payload returns. It's small now, but if it keeps building." Selmar's frown deepened. "You believe this could lead to instability?" "I know it could," Nate said, standing. "We need to figure out what's causing it before we send anything else through that gateway." The assembly convened an emergency meeting the next day. Nate presented his findings to a room full of skeptical scientists and wary delegates. "These surges aren't random," he said, pointing to a holographic display of the gateway's energy matrix. "They're a feedback loop, building up every time we use the wormhole. Right now, the gateway can handle it, but if we keep pushing it, it's only a matter of time before it goes critical." "Preposterous," a Corlean delegate scoffed. "The gateway has performed flawlessly under rigorous testing. A few minor fluctuations do not constitute a crisis." "Tell that to the guy who'd be standing next to it when it blows," Nate shot back. Kira stepped forward, her glow steady. "The humans' findings warrant further investigation. We cannot ignore the possibility of a systemic flaw." "And what do you propose?" Selmar asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Nate crossed his arms. "Shut it down. Temporarily. We need to figure out what's causing the surges before we use it again." The room erupted into murmurs. Shutting down the gateway, even temporarily, would mean halting critical missions and delaying the collective's ambitious plans. "Unacceptable," the Corlean delegate said. "The gateway is the centerpiece of our future endeavors. To halt its operations now would save lives," Nate interrupted, his voice sharp. "Look, I get it. You've all got big plans for this thing. But trust me, if you ignore this, you're not just risking your projects, you're risking everything." The debate raged for hours with no consensus in sight. Ultimately, the assembly agreed to continue gateway operations under stricter monitoring while Nate and a team of specialists investigated the surges. Frustrated but determined, Nate threw himself into the work. He assembled a diverse team of scientists, Zorvaxians, Tevalins, Corleans, each bringing their expertise to the table. Together they analyzed the gateway's energy harmonics, rerun simulations, and conducted controlled experiments. After days of relentless effort, they found the culprit. "It's the frame," Nate said during another assembly meeting, pointing to the holographic projection of the gateway. "The crystalline panels aren't just conducting energy, they're amplifying it. Every time we use the wormhole, they're creating a feedback loop with Voral Prime's magnetic field." Selmar's expression darkened. "And the solution?" "We need to recalibrate the panels," Nate said. "Realign their resonance to counteract the magnetic interference instead of amplifying it. It'll take time, but it'll stop the surges." A Corlean scientist raised a clawed hand. "And if the recalibration fails?" "Then we shut it down for good," Nate said simply. The recalibration process began immediately. The team worked tirelessly, adjusting the crystalline panels and reprogramming the gateway's core algorithms. Every adjustment was meticulously tested, every variable accounted for. As the final adjustments were made, the tension in the lab was palpable. Scientists crowded around the consoles, their eyes fixed on the monitors. "This is it," Selmar said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "Activate the gateway." Nate stood at the main console, his finger hovering over the activation switch. He glanced at Kira, who gave him a reassuring nod. "Here goes nothing," Nate muttered, flipping the switch. The crystalline frame flared to life, its surface shimmering with energy. The vortex formed smoothly, its edges steady and precise. The room held its breath as the monitors displayed the gateway's energy levels. "Stability achieved," Kira reported, her glow brightening with relief. The lab erupted into applause, but Nate didn't join in. He stared at the vortex, his gut still tight with unease. Something about the smooth surface felt too perfect, too calm. He turned to Kira, his voice low. "Let's hope we didn't miss anything." The gateway glimmered serenely within its crystalline frame, a portrait of stability that seemed almost defiant after the months of turbulence. The recalibration had worked, at least, according to the monitors. Delegates and scientists filled the lab with cautious optimism, their once skeptical expressions softening as the numbers held steady. Nate, however, stood apart, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the vortex. His instincts, sharpened by years of wrestling with systems that had no business working, nagged at him like a phantom itch. "You're still not convinced," Kira said, stepping beside him. Her glow was calm, a pale lavender that mirrored the cautious mood of the room. "I want to be," Nate said, his voice low. "But something doesn't feel right." Selmar overheard, his crimson eyes narrowing. "The gateway's readings are optimal, Mr. Calloway. If you are expecting perfection beyond this, you will be waiting forever." "I'm not expecting perfection," Nate replied, his tone sharper than intended. "I'm expecting something to go wrong because it always does. You call it paranoia. I call it experience." Before Selmar could respond, an alert sounded across the lab. "Incoming object," a technician announced. "A vessel is approaching the gateway from the other side." Selmar frowned. "There are no scheduled missions. What vessel?" "It's the Daedalus," the technician said, their voice tinged with confusion. "But that's impossible. The Daedalus completed its mission and returned days ago." A hush fell over the room. On the monitors, the gateway's telemetry displayed the unmistakable signature of the Daedalus as it approached the vortex. "Could it be a ghost signal?" Kira asked, her glow dimming with unease. "No," Nate said, his stomach tightening. "That's too specific. It's not a signal, it's the ship." Selmar's fingers flew over the console. "Activating scan." The monitors flickered, displaying a grainy image of the incoming vessel. It was unmistakably the Daedalus, but its hull was scorched and warped, as if it had passed through a cosmic furnace. "Energy readings are erratic," a Corlean scientist reported. "There are no life signs aboard." "How is that possible?" Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nate took a step closer to the vortex, his eyes narrowing. What if this isn't the same Daedalus? What if it's a version of it? Selmar turned sharply. "Are you suggesting this is an alternate reality artifact?" "I don't know," Nate admitted. "But if the wormhole's harmonics weren't fully stabilized during the earlier missions, Maybe they opened more than one door. The room erupted into tense murmurs as the implications sank in. We have to pull it through, Nate said. What Selmar snapped. The risks are already here, Nate interrupted. If we leave it out there, we'll never know what's going on. We need answers, and that ship's got them. Selmar hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Activate retrieval protocols. The gateway flared as the Daedalus crossed the threshold. Sparks erupted from its scorched hull as it settled in the containment field. The lab filled with a faint metallic tang, the smell of burnt alloys and ozone. Nate moved cautiously toward the ship, his breath steady. Cura, any active energy readings inside? Negative, she said, her glow flickering nervously. The vessel is inert. Good, Nate muttered. Let's keep it that way. The lab's automated arms began dissecting the ship, extracting its black box and onboard systems for analysis. As the data streamed in, Nate's unease deepened. This can't be right, he said, pointing to the monitor. What are you seeing? Cura asked, leaning closer. The Daedalus's black box says it never left its target system, Nate said. According to this, it got stuck on the far side of the wormhole and never came back. So how did we get the crew days ago? Selmar's expression darkened. You're suggesting the ship we retrieved earlier wasn't the Daedalus. Not the one from this timeline, Nate said grimly. The realization hit the room like a thunderclap. If the gateway had been tampering with alternate realities, the implications were staggering and dangerous. Shut it down, Selmar ordered. Nate stepped in front of the console. No. No, Selmar repeated, his voice rising. If you shut it down now, we might lose the chance to figure out what went wrong, Nate said. This isn't just about the gateway anymore. If we're messing with alternate realities, we need to understand how deep this goes. Selmar hesitated, his hands hovering over the console. Cura stepped forward, her glow steady. Nate is correct. If we act hastily, we risk compounding the damage. Over the next tense hours, the team worked to dissect the gateway's interactions with alternate realities. They discovered subtle but profound anomalies in the wormhole's harmonics, echoes of other timelines intersecting with their own. It's like tuning a radio, Nate explained. We're picking up signals from other stations without meaning to. The gateway isn't just a bridge, it's a beacon. A beacon that others may respond to, Cura said, her glow dimming. Selmar looked grim. Then we must correct the resonance permanently. No further use of the gateway until we isolate our timeline entirely. And if we can't, Corleone asked. Then we shut it down, Selmar said, glancing at Nate. Agreed, Nate said. But first, let's finish what we started. After hours of painstaking recalibration, the gateway was activated for a final test. The vortex formed, its energy calm and steady. For the first time, the harmonics held true, the echoes of alternate timelines silenced. The team monitored the vortex with bated breath as a small probe was sent through. It returned moments later, its telemetry flawless. It's stable, Cura said, her voice filled with cautious relief. Nate exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at his lips. Well, how about that? Selmar turned to him, his expression unreadable. You have done the impossible, Mr. Calloway. Yeah, Nate said, cracking open a fresh beer. Now let's hope the universe doesn't have any more surprises for us. As the gateway hummed steadily, the lab erupted into applause. Nate allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, knowing full well that the future would hold challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for now, the impossible had been conquered, and he'd earned his victory.